Volume 2, Chapter 32 of Marriage. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Volume 2 of Marriage by Susan Ferrier. Chapter 32. On est guère oblige aux gens qui ne nous viennent voir, que pour nous quereller, qui pendant toute une visite ne nous disent pas une seule parole bien gentille, et qui se font un place malin d'attaquer notre conduit et de nous faire entrevoir nos défauts. L'Abbé del Bellegarde. The Duke, although not possessed of the most delicate feelings, it may be supposed was not insensible to his dishonour. He immediately set about taking the legal measures for avenging it, and damages were awarded, which would have the effect of rendering Lord Lindore for ever an alien to his country. Lady Juliana raved and had hysterics, and seemed to consider herself as the only sufferer by her daughter's misconduct. At one time Adelaide's ingratitude was all her theme, at another it was Lord Lindore's treachery, and poor Adelaide was everything that was amiable and injured. Then it was the Duke's obstinacy, for had Adelaide got leave to do as she liked, this never would have happened. Had she only got leave to give balls and go to masquerades, she would have made the best wife in the world, etc., etc., etc. All this was warmly resented by Lady Matilda, supported by Mrs. Finch and General Carver, till open hostilities were declared between the ladies, and Lady Juliana was compelled to quit the house she had looked upon as next to her own, and became once more a denizen of Beech Park. Mary's grief and horror at her sister's misconduct were proportioned to the nature of the offence. She considered it not as how it might affect herself, or would be viewed by the world, but as a crime committed against the law of God. Yet, while she the more deeply deplored it on that account, no bitter words of condemnation passed her lips. She thought with humility of the superior advantages she had enjoyed in having principles of religion early and deeply engrafted in her soul, and that, but for these, such as her sister's fate was, hers might have been. She felt for her mother, undeserving as she was of commiseration, and strove by every means in her power to promote her comfort and happiness. But that was no easy task. Lady Juliana's notions of comfort and happiness differed as widely from those of her daughter as reason and folly could possibly do. She was indeed than folly more a fool, a melancholy fool without her bells. She still clung to low earth-born vanities with as much avidity as though she had never experienced their insecurity, still rung the same changes on the joys of wealth and grandeur, as if she had had actual proof of their unfading felicity. Then she recurred to the Duke's obstinacy and Lord Lindore's artifices, till after having exhausted herself in invective against them, she concluded by comforting herself with the hope that Lord Lindore and Adelaide would marry. And although it would be a prodigious degradation to her, and she could not be received at court, she might yet get into very good society in town. There were many women of high rank exactly in the same situation, who had been driven to elope from their husbands, and who married the men they liked and made the best wives in the world. Mary heard all this in shame and silence, but Lady Emily, wearied and provoked by her folly and want of principle, was often led to express her indignation and contempt in terms which drew tears from her cousin's eyes. Mary was indeed the only person in the world who felt her sister's dereliction with the keenest feelings of shame and sorrow. All Adelaide's coldness and unkindness had not been able to eradicate from her heart those deep-rooted sentiments of affection which seem to have been entwined with our existence, and which, with some generous natures, end but with their being. Yes, there are ties that bind together those of one family, stronger than those of taste, or choice, or friendship, or reason, for they enable us to love even in opposition to them all. It was understood the fugitives had gone to Germany, and after wonder and scandal were exhausted, and a divorce obtained, the Duchess of Altamont, except to her own family, was as though she had never been. Such is the transition from guilt to insignificance. Amongst the numerous visitors who flocked to Beech Park, whether from sympathy, curiosity, or exultation, was Mrs. Downe Wright. None of these motives singly had brought that lady there, for her purpose was that of giving what she genteelly termed some good hits to the Douglases' pride, a delicate mode of warfare in which it must be owned the female sex greatly excel. Mrs. Downe Wright had not forgiven the indignity of her son having been refused by Mary, which she imputed entirely to Lady Emily's influence, and had from that moment predicted the downfall of the whole pack, as she styled the family, at the same time always expressing her wish that she might be mistaken, as she wished them well. God knows she bore them no ill will, etc. She entered the drawing-room at Beech Park with a countenance cast to a totally different expression from that with which she had greeted Lady Matilda Sufton's widowhood. Melancholy would there have been appropriate. Here it was insulting, and accordingly, with downcast eyes and silent pressures of the hand, she saluted every member of the family, and inquired after their health with that air of anxious solicitude which implied that if they were all well, it was what they ought not to be. Lady Emily's quick tact was presently aware of her design, and she prepared to take the field against her. "I had some difficulty in getting admittance to you," said Mrs. Downe Wright. "The servant would fain have denied you, but at such a time I knew the visit of a friend could not fail of being acceptable, so I made my way in spite of him." "I had given orders to be at home to friends only," returned Lady Emily, "as there is no end to the inroads of acquaintances." "And poor Lady Juliana," said Mrs. Downe Wright in a tone of affected sympathy, "I hope she is able to see her friends." "Did you not meet her?" asked Lady Emily carelessly. "She is just gone to Bath for the purpose of securing a box during the term of Kean's engagement. She would not trust to l'éloquence du billet upon such an occasion." "I'm vastly happy to hear she is able for anything of the kind," in a tone of vehement and overstrained joy, rather unsuitable to the occasion. A well-feigned look of surprise from Lady Emily made her fear she had overshot her mark. She therefore, as if from delicacy, changed the conversation to her own affairs. She soon contrived to let it be known that her son was going to be married to a Scotch earl's daughter, that she was to reside with them, and that she had merely come to Bath for the purpose of letting her house, breaking up her establishment, packing up her plate, and, in short, making all those magnificent arrangements which wealthy dowagers usually have to perform on a change of residence. At the end of this triumphant declaration she added, "I fain would have the young people live by themselves, and let me just go on in my own way, but neither my son nor Lady Grace would hear of that, although her family are my son's nearest neighbours, and most sensible, agreeable people they are. Indeed, as I said to Lord Glenallan, a man's happiness depends fully as much upon his wife's family as upon herself." Mary was too noble-minded to suspect that Mrs. Downe Wright could intend to level innuendos, but the allusion struck her. She felt herself blush, and fearful Mrs. Downe Wright would attribute it to the wrong motive. She hastened to join in the eulogium on the Ben Mavis family in general, and Lady Grace in particular. Lady Ben Mavis is, indeed, a sensible, well-principled woman, and her daughters have been all well brought up. Again Mary coloured at the emphasis which marked the sensible, well-principled mother and the well-brought-up daughters, and in some confusion she said something about Lady Grace's beauty. "She certainly is a very pretty woman," said Mrs. Downe Wright with affected carelessness, "but what is better, she is out of a good nest. For my own part, I place little value upon beauty now, commend me to principles. If a woman is without principles, the less beauty she has, the better." "If a woman has no principles," said Lady Emily, "I don't think it signifies a straw whether she has beauty or not. Ugliness can never add to one's virtues." "I beg your pardon, Lady Emily. A plain woman will never make herself so conspicuous in the world as one of your beauties. Then you are of opinion wickedness lies all in the eye of the world, not in the depths of the heart. Now I think the person who cherishes, no matter how secretly, pride, envy, hatred, malice, or any other besetting sin, must be quite as criminal in the sight of God as those who openly indulge their evil propensity." "I go very much by outward actions," said Mrs. Downright. "They are all we have to judge by." "But I thought we were forbidden to judge one another." "There's no shutting people's mouths, Lady Emily." "No, all that is required, I believe, is that we should shut our own." Mary thought the conversation was getting rather too piquant to be pleasant, and tried to soften the tone of it by asking the most innocent question, whether there was any news. "Nothing but about battles and fightings, I suppose," answered Mrs. Downright. "I'm sure they are to be pitied, who have friends or relations either in army or navy at present. I have reason to be thankful my son is in neither. He was very much set upon going into one or other, but I was always averse to it; for, independent of the danger, they are professions that spoil a man for domestic life. They lead to such expensive, dissipated habits as quite ruin them for family men. I never knew a military man but what must have his bottle of port every day. With sailors, indeed, it's still worse. Grog and tobacco soon destroy them. I'm sure if I had a daughter, it would make me miserable if she was to take fancy to a naval or military man. But," as if suddenly recollecting herself, "after all, perhaps it's a mere prejudice of mine." "By no means," said Lady Emily. "There is no prejudice in the matter. What you say is very true. They are to be envied who can contrive to fall in love with a stupid idle man. They never can experience any anxiety. Their fate is fixed. The waveless calm, the slumber of the dead is theirs, as long as they can contrive to slumber on, or at least to keep their eyes shut. 'Tis very well they are in no danger of stumbling till they come to open them, and if they are sufficiently stupid themselves, there is no danger of their doing even that. They have only to copy the owl, and they are safe." "I quite agree with your ladyship," said Mrs. Downright, with a well-got-up, good-humoured laugh. "A woman has only not to be a wit or a genius, and there is no fear of her. Not that I have that antipathy to a clever woman that many people have, and especially the gentlemen. I almost quarrelled with Mr. Headley, the great author, t'other day, for saying that he would rather encounter a nest of wasps than a clever woman." "I should have most cordially have agreed with him," said Lady Emily, with equal naivety. "There is nothing more insupportable than one of your clever women so called. They are generally underbred, consequently vulgar. They pique themselves upon saying good things cote qu'il cou. There is something, in short, quite professional about them, and they wouldn't condescend to chat nonsense as you and I are doing at this moment. Oh, not for worlds. Now I think one of the great charms of life consists in talking nonsense. Good nonsense is an exquisite thing, and 'tis an exquisite thing to be stupid sometimes, and to say nothing at all. Now, these enjoyments the clever woman must forego. Clever she is, and clever she must be. Her life must be a greater drudgery than that of any actress. She merely frets her hour upon the stage. The curtain dropped, she may become as dull as she chooses, but the clever woman must always stage it, even at her own fireside. Lady Emily Lindore is certainly the last person from whom I should have expected to hear a panegyric on stupidity," said Mrs. Downright with some bitterness. "Stupidity? Oh, heavens! My blood curdles at the thought of real, genuine, downright stupidity. No, I should always like to have the command of intellect, as well as of money, though my taste or my indolence or my whim, perhaps, never would incline me to be always sparkling, whether in wit or in diamonds. 'Twas only when I was in the nursery that I envied the good girl who spoke rubies and pearls. Now it seems to me only just better than not spitting toads and vipers." And she warbled a sprightly French ariette to a tame bullfinch that flew upon her hand. There was an airy high-bred elegance in Lady Emily's impertinence that seemed to throw Mrs. Downright's coarse sarcasms to an immeasurable distance, and that lady was beginning to despair. But she was determined not to give in while she could possibly stand out. She accordingly rallied her forces and turned to Mary. "So you have lost your neighbour, Mrs. Lennox, since I was here. I think she was an acquaintance of yours. Poor woman, her death must have been a happy release to herself and her friends. She has left no family, I believe?" Quite aware of the report of Mary's engagement with Colonel Lennox. "Only one son," said Mary with a little emotion. "Oh, very true. He's in the law, I think." "In the army," answered Mary faintly. "That's a poor trade," said Mrs. Downright, "and I doubt he'll not have much to mend it. Rose Hall's but a poor property. I've heard they might have had a good estate in Scotland if it hadn't been for the pride of the General, that wouldn't let him change his name for it. He thought it grander to be a poor Lennox than a rich Macnaughton, or some such name. It's to be hoped the son's of the same mind." "I have no doubt of it," said Lady Emily. "'Tis a noble name, quite a legacy in itself." "It's one that, I am afraid, will not be easily turned into bank notes, however," returned Mrs. Downright with a real hearty laugh. And then, delighted to get off with what she called flying colours, she hastily rose with an exclamation at the lateness of the hour, and a remark how quickly time passed in pleasant company, and with friendly shakes of the hand withdrew. "How very insupportable is such a woman," said Lady Emily to Mary, "who, to gratify her own malice, says the most cutting things to her neighbours, and at the same time feels self-approbation in the belief that she is doing good. And yet, hateful as she is, I have sometimes been amused by her ill nature when it was directed against people I hated still more. Lady Matilda Sufton, for example. There she certainly shone, for hypocrisy is always fair game, and yet the people who love to hunt it are never amiable. You smile as much as to say, here is Satan preaching a sermon on holiness. But however satirical and intolerant you may think me, you must own that I take no delight in the discovery of other people's faults. If I want the meekness of a Christian, at least I don't possess the malice of a Jew. Now Mrs. Downright has a real heartfelt satisfaction in saying malicious things, and in thrusting herself into company where she must know she is unwelcome, for the sole purpose of saying them. Yet many people are blessed with such blunt perceptions, that they are not at all aware of her real character, and only wonder, when she has left them, what made them feel so uncomfortable when she was present. But she has put me in such a bad humour that I must go out of door and apostrophise the sun, like Lucifer. Do come, Mary, you will help to dispel my chagrin. I really feel as if my heart has been in a lime kiln. All its kingly feelings are so burnt up by the malignant influences of Mrs. Downright, while you," continued she, as they strolled into the gardens, "are as cool and as sweet and as sorrowful as these violets, gathering some, still wet with an April shower. How delicious, after such a mental sirocco, to feel the pure air and hear the birds sing, and look upon the flowers and blossoms, and sit here and bask in the sun from laziness to walk into the shade. You must needs acknowledge, Mary, that spring in England is a much more amiable season than in your ungentle clime." This was the second spring Mary had seen set in England, but the first had been wayward and backward as the seasons of her native climate. The present was such a one as poets love to paint. Nature was in all its first freshness and beauty. The ground was covered with flowers, the luxuriant hedgerows were white with blossoms, the air was impregnated with the odours of the gardens and orchards. Still Mary sighed as she thought of Lochmarlie, its wild tangled woods, with here and there a bunch of primroses peeping forth from amidst moss and withered ferns, its gurgling rills, blue lakes and rocks and mountains, all rose to view, and she felt that even amid fairer scenes and beneath brighter suns, her heart would still turn with fond regret to the land of her birth. End of Volume 2, Chapter 32. Volume 2, Chapter 33 of Marriage. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Volume 2 of Marriage by Susan Ferrier. Chapter 33. Wondrous it is to see in diverse minds how diversely love doth his pageants play, and shows his power in variable kinds. Spenser. But even the charms of spring were overlooked by Lady Emily in the superior delight she experienced at hearing that the ship in which Edward Douglas was had arrived at Portsmouth, and the intelligence was soon followed by his own arrival at Beech Park. He was received by her with rapture, and by Mary with the tenderest emotion. Lord Courtland was always glad of an addition to the family party, and even Lady Juliana experienced something like emotion as she beheld her son, now the exact image of what his father had been 20 years before. Edward Douglas was indeed a perfect model of youthful beauty, and possessed all of the high spirits and happy insouciance which can only charm at that early period. He loved his profession, and had already distinguished himself in it. He was handsome, brave, good-hearted, and good-humoured, but he was not clever, and Mary felt some solicitude as to the permanency of Lady Emily's attachment to him. But Lady Emily, quick-sighted to the defects of the whole world, seemed happily blind to those of her lover, and when even Mary's spirits were almost exhausted by his noisy rattle, Lady Emily, charmed and exhilarated, entered into all his practical jokes and boyish frolics with the greatest of delight. She soon perceived what was passing in Mary's mind. "I see perfectly well what you think of my penchant for Edward," said she one day. "I can tell you exactly what was passing in your thoughts just now. You were thinking how strange, how passing strange it is that I, who am, false modesty avant, certainly cleverer than Edward, should yet be so partial to him, and that my lynx eyes should have failed to discover in him faults which, with a single glance, I should have detected in others. Now, can't you guess what renders even those very faults so attractive to me?" "The old story, I suppose," said Mary. "Love." "Not at all. Love might blind me to his faults altogether, and then my case would be indeed hopeless, were I living in the belief that I was loving a piece of perfection, a sort of Apollo Belvedere in mind as well as in person. Now, so far from that, I could reckon you up a whole catalogue of his faults, and nevertheless I love him with my whole heart, faults and all. In the first place, they are faults with which I have been familiar from infancy, and therefore they possess a charm, to my shame be it said, greater than other people's virtues would have to me. They come over my fancy like some snatch of an old nursery song, which one loves to hear in defiance of taste and reason, merely because it is something that carries us back to those days, which, whatever they were in reality, always look bright and sunny in retrospection. In the second place, his faults are real, genuine, natural faults, and in this age of affectation, how refreshing it is to meet with even a natural fault. I grant you, Edward talks absurdly, and asks questions, à faire dresser les chevaux of a Mrs. Bluemits, But that amuses me, for his ignorance is not the ignorance of vulgarity or stupidity, but the ignorance of a light head and a merry heart, of one, in short, whose understanding has been at sea when other people's were at school. His bon mots certainly would not do to be printed, but then they make me laugh a great deal more than if they were better, for he is always naif and original, and I prefer an indifferent original any day to a good copy. How it shocks me to hear people recommending to their children to copy such a person's manners. A copied manner, how insupportable. The servile imitator of a set pattern, how despicable. No, I would rather have Edward in all the freshness of his own faults, rather than in the faded semblance of another person's proprieties. Mary agreed to the truth of her cousin's observations in some respects, though she could not help thinking that love had as much to say in her case as in most others, for if it did not blind her to her lover's faults, it certainly made her much more tolerant of them. Edward was, in truth, at times almost provokingly boyish and unthinking, and possessed a flow of animal spirits as inexhaustible as they were sometimes overpowering. But she flattered herself time would subdue them to a more rational tone, and she longed for his having the advantages of Colonel Lennox's society, not by way of pattern, as Lady Emily expressed it, but that he might be gradually led to something of more refinement from holding intercourse with a superior mind, and she obtained her wish sooner than she had dared to hope for it. The battle was fought which decided the fate of Europe, and turned so many swords into ploughshares, and Mary seemed now touching the pinnacle of happiness when she saw her lover restored to her. He had gained additional renown in the bloody field of Waterloo, and more fortunate than others, his military career had terminated both gloriously and happily. If Mary had ever distrusted the reality of his affection, all her doubts were now at an end. She saw she was beloved with all the truth and ardour of a noble ingenuous mind, too upright to deceive others, too enlightened to deceive itself. All reserve betwixt them was now at an end, and secure in mutual affection, nothing seemed to oppose itself to their happiness. Colonel Lennox's fortune was small, but such as it was, it seemed sufficient for all the purposes of rational enjoyment. Both were aware that wealth is a relative thing, and that the positively rich are not those who have the largest possessions, but those who have the fewest vain or selfish desires to gratify. From these they were happily exempt. Both possessed too many resources in their own minds to require the stimulus of spending money to rouse them into enjoyment, or give them additional importance in the eyes of the world. And above all, both were too thoroughly Christian in their principles to murmur at any sacrifices or privations they might have to endure in the course of their earthly pilgrimage. But Lady Juliana's weak worldly mind saw things in a very different light, and when Colonel Lennox, as a matter of form, applied to her for her consent to their union, he received a positive and angry refusal. She declared she never would consent to any daughter of hers making so foolish, so very unsuitable a marriage. And then, sending for Mary, she charged her, in the most peremptory manner, to break off all intercourse with Colonel Lennox. Poor Mary was overwhelmed with grief and amazement at this new display of her mother's tyranny and injustice, and used all the powers of reasoning and entreaty to alter her sentiments, but in vain. Since Adelaide's elopement, Lady Juliana had been much in want of some subject to occupy her mind, something to excite a sensation, and give her something to complain of and talk about, and put her in a bustle, and make her angry and alarmed, and ill-used, and in short all the things which a fool is fond of being. Although Mary had little hopes of being able to prevail by any efforts of reason, she yet tried to make her mother comprehend the nature of her engagement with Colonel Lennox as of a sacred nature, and too binding ever to be dissolved. But Lady Juliana's wrath blazed forth with redoubled violence at the very mention of an engagement. She had never heard of anything so improper. Colonel Lennox must be a most unprincipled man to lead her daughter into an engagement unsanctioned by her, and she had acted in the most improper manner in allowing herself to form an attachment without the consent of those who had the best title to dispose of her. The person who could act thus was not fit to be trusted, and in future it would be necessary for her to have her constantly under her own eye. Mary found her candour had therefore only reduced her to the alternative of either openly rebelling or of submitting to being talked at and watched and guarded as if she had been detected in carrying on some improper clandestine intercourse. But she submitted to all the restrictions that were imposed and the torments that were inflicted, if not with the heroism of a martyr, at least with the meekness of one, for no murmur escaped her lips. She was only anxious to conceal from others the extent of her mother's folly and injustice, and took every opportunity of entreating Colonel Lennox's silence and forbearance. It required indeed all her influence to induce him to submit patiently to the treatment he experienced. Lady Juliana had so often repeated to Mary that it was the greatest presumption in Colonel Lennox to aspire to a daughter of hers, that she had fairly talked herself into the belief that he was all she asserted him to be, a man of neither birth nor fortune, certainly a Scotsman from his name, consequently having thousands of poor cousins and vulgar relations of every description, and she was determined that no daughter of hers should ever marry a man whose family connections she knew nothing about. She had suffered a great deal too much from her Mary's father's low relations ever to run the risk of anything of the same kind happening again. In short, she had at length made it out clearly, to her own satisfaction, that Colonel Lennox was scarcely a gentleman, and she therefore considered it as her duty to treat him on every occasion with the most marked rudeness. Colonel Lennox pitied her folly too much to be hurt by her ill-breeding and malevolence, but he could scarcely reconcile it to his notions of duty that Mary's superior mind should submit to the thraldom of one who evidently knew not good from evil. Lady Emily was so much engrossed by her own affairs that for some time all this went on unnoticed by her. At length she was struck with Mary's dejection, and observed that Colonel Lennox seemed also dispirited, but, imputing it to a lover's quarrel, she laughingly taxed them with it. Although Mary could suppress the cause of her uneasiness, she was too ingenuous to deny it, and being pressed by her cousin, she at length disclosed to her the cause of her sorrow. "Colonel Lennox and you have behaved like two fools," said she, at the end of her cousin's communication. "What could possibly instigate you to so absurd an act as that of asking Lady Juliana's consent? You surely might have known that the person who is never consulted about anything will invariably start difficulties to everything, and that people who are never accustomed to be even listened to get quite unmanageable when appealed to." Lady Juliana gave an immediate assent to Lord Glenallan's proposals, because she was the first person consulted about them, and besides, she had a sort of an instinctive knowledge that it would create a sensation and make her of consequence. In short, she was to act in a sort of triple capacity, as parent, lover, and bride. Here, on the contrary, she was aware that her consent would stand as a mere cipher, and once given, would never be more heard of. Liberty of opinion is an attitude many people quite lose themselves in. When once they attempt to think, it makes confusion, worse, confounded. So it is much better to take that labour off their hands, and settle the matter for them. It would have been quite time enough to have asked Lady Juliana's consent after the thing was over, or at any rate the minute before it was to take place. I would not even have allowed her time for a flood of tears or a fit of hysterics. And now that your duty has brought you to this, Even my genius is at a loss how to extricate you. Gretna Green might have been advisable, and that would have accorded with your notions of duty. That would have been following in your mamma's own footsteps, but it is become too vulgar an exploit. I read of a hatter's apprentice having carried off a grocer's heiress t'other day. What do you purpose doing yourself?" "To try the effect of patience and submission," said Mary, "rather than openly set at defiance one of the most sacred duties, the obedience of a child to a parent. Besides, I could not possibly be happy were I to marry under such circumstances." "You have much too nice a conscience," said Lady Emily, "and yet I could scarcely wish you otherwise than you are. What an angel you are, to behave as you do to such a mother, with such sweetness and gentleness and even respect. Ah, they know little of human nature who think that, to perform great actions, one must necessarily be a great character. So far from that, I now see there may be much more real greatness of mind displayed in the quiet tenor of a woman's life than in the most brilliant exploits that ever were performed by man. Methinks I myself could help to storm a city, but to rule my own spirit is a task beyond me. What a pity it is you and I cannot change places. Here am I languishing for a little opposition to my love. My marriage will be quite an insipid everyday affair. I yawn already to think of it. Can anything be more disheartening to a young couple, anxious to signalise their attachment in the face of the whole world, than to be allowed to take their own way? Conceive my vexation at being told by papa this morning that he had not the least objection to Edward and me marrying whenever we pleased, although he thought we might both have done better, but that was our own affair, not his, and that he thought Edward a fine good-humoured fellow, excessively amusing, hoped he would get a ship some day, although he had no interest whatever in the Admiralty, was sorry he could not give us any money, but hoped we should remain at Beech Park as long as we liked. I really feel quite flat with all these dull affirmations." "What, you had rather have been locked up in a tower, wringing your hands at the height of the windows, the thickness of the walls, and so forth," said Mary. "No, I should never have done anything so like a washerwoman as to wring my hands, though I might, like some heroines, have fallen to work in a regular blacksmith way, by examining the lock of the door, and perhaps having succeeded in picking it. But alas, I live in degenerate days. Oh, that I had been born the persecuted daughter of some ancient baron bold, instead of the spoiled child of a good-natured modern earl. Heavens, to think that I must tamely, abjectly submit to be married in the presence of all my family, even in the very parish church. Oh, what detractions from the brilliancy of my star!" In spite of her levity, Lady Emily was seriously interested in her cousin's affairs, and tried every means of obtaining Lady Juliana's consent. But Lady Juliana was become more unmanageable than ever. Her temper, always bad, was now soured by chagrin and disappointment into something, if possible, still worse, and Lady Emily's authority had no longer any control over her. Even the threat of producing Aunt Grizzy to a brilliant assembly had now lost its effect. Dr. Redgill was the only auxiliary she possessed in the family, and he most cordially joined in condemning Miss Mary's obstinacy and infatuation. What could she see in a man with such an insignificant bit of property, a mere nest for blackbirds and linnets and such sort of vermin? Not a morsel of any sort of game on his grounds, while at Glenallen he had been credibly informed such was the abundance, that the deer had been seen stalking and the blackcock flying past the very door. But the doctor's indignation was suddenly suspended by a fit of apoplexy, from which, however, he rallied, and passed it off for the present as a sort of vertigo, in consequence of the shock he had received at hearing of Miss Mary's misconduct. At length even Colonel Lennox's forbearance was exhausted, and Mary's health and spirits were sinking beneath the conflict she had to maintain, when a sudden revolution in Lady Juliana's plans caused also a revolution in her sentiments. This was occasioned by a letter from Adelaide, now Lady Lindore. It was evidently written under the influence of melancholy and discontent, and, as Lady Emily said, nothing could be a stronger proof of poor Adelaide's wretchedness than her expressing a wish that her mother should join her in the south of France, where she was going on account of her health. Adelaide was indeed one of the many melancholy proofs of the effects of headstrong passions and perverted principles. Lord Lindore had married her from a point of honour, and although he possessed too much refinement to treat her ill, yet his indifference was not the less cutting to a spirit haughty as hers. Like many others, she had vainly imagined that in renouncing virtue itself for the man she loved, she was for ever ensuring his boundless gratitude and adoration, and she only awoke from her delusive dream to find herself friendless in a foreign land, an outcast from society, an object of indifference even to him for whom she had abandoned all. But Lady Juliana would see nothing of all this. She was charmed at what she termed this proof of her daughter's affection, in wishing to have her with her, and the prospect of going abroad seemed like a vision of paradise to her. Instant preparations were made for her departure, and in the bustle attendant on them, Mary and her affairs sank into utter insignificance. Indeed, she seemed rather anxious to get her disposed of in any way that might prevent her interfering with her own plans, and a consent to her marriage, such as it was easily obtained. "Marry whom you please," said she, "only remember I am not responsible for the consequences. I have always told you what a wretched thing a love marriage is, therefore you are not to blame me for your future misery." Mary readily subscribed to the conditions, but, as she embraced her mother at parting, she timidly whispered a hope that she would ever consider her house as her home. A smile of contempt was the only reply she received, and they parted never more to meet. Lady Juliana found foreign manners and principles too congenial to her taste ever to return to Britain. End of Volume 2, Chapter 33. Volume 2, Chapter 34 of Marriage. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michele Eaton. Volume 2 of Marriage by Susan Ferrier. Chapter 34. O most gentle Jupiter, what tedious homily of love have you wearied your parishioners withal, and never cried, "Have patience, good people," as you like it. The only obstacle to her union thus removed, Mary thought she might now venture to let her Aunt Grizzy into the secret, and accordingly, with some little embarrassment, she made the disclosure of the mutual attachment subsisting between Colonel Lennox and herself. Grizzy received the communication with all the astonishment which ladies usually experience upon being made acquainted with a marriage which they had not had the prescience to foresee and foretell, or even one which they had. For common and natural as the event seems to be, it is one which perhaps in no instance ever took place without occasioning the greatest amazement to some one individual or another, and it will also be generally found that either the good or the bad fortune of one or other of the parties is the subject of universal wonder. In short, a marriage which excites no surprise, pity, or indignation must be something that has never yet been witnessed on the face of this round world. It is greatly to be feared none of my readers will sympathise in the feelings of the good spinster on this occasion, as she poured them forth in the following extempore or improvisatorial strain. Well, Mary, I declare I'm perfectly confounded with all you have been telling me. I'm sure I never heard the like of it. It seems but the other day since you began your sampler, and it looks just like yesterday since your father and mother were married. And such a work as there was at your nursing, I'm sure your poor grandfather was out of all patience about it. And now to think that you are going to be married. Not but what it's a thing we all expected, but for there's no doubt England's the place for young women to get husbands. We always said that, you know. Not but what I dare say you might have been married, too, if you had stayed in the Highlands, and to a real Highlander, too, which of course would have been still better for us all. for it will be a sad thing if you are obliged to stay in England, Mary, but I hope there's no chance of that. You know Colonel Lennox can easily sell his place and buy an estate in the Highlands. There's a charming property, I know, to be sold just now, that marches with Glenfern. To be sure it's on the wrong side of the hill, there's no denying that, but then there's I can't tell you how many thousand acres of fine muir for shooting, and I dare say Colonel Lennox is a keen sportsman, and they say a great deal of it might be very much improved. We must really inquire after it, Mary, and you must speak to Colonel Lennox about it, for you know such a property as that may be snapped up in a minute." Mary assented to all that was said, and Grizzy proceeded. "I wonder you never brought Colonel Lennox to see us, Mary. I'm sure he must think it very odd. To be sure, Sir Sampson's situation is some excuse, but at any rate I wonder you never spoke about him. We all found out your Aunt Bella's attachment from the very first, just from her constantly speaking about Major MacTavish and the militia, and we had a good guess of Betsy's too, from the day her face turned so red after giving Captain MacNab for her toast. But you have really kept yours very close, for I declare I have never once suspected such a thing. I wonder if that was Colonel Lennox that I saw you part with at the door one day, tall and with brown hair and a blue coat. I asked Lady Maclaughlan if she knew who it was, and she said it was Admiral Benbow, but I think she must have been mistaken, for I dare say now it was just Colonel Lennox. Lennox, I'm sure, should be able to remember something about somebody of that name, but my memory is not so good as it used to be, for I have so many things, you know, to think about with Sir Sampson, that I declare sometimes my head's quite confused, yet I think always there's something about them. I wish to goodness Lady Maclaughlan was come from the dentist, that I might consult her about it, for of course you'll do nothing without consulting all your friends. I know you've too much sense for that, and here's Sir Sampson coming. It will be a fine piece of news to tell him." Sir Sampson, having been now wheeled in by the still active Philistine, and properly arranged with the assistance of Miss Grizzy, she took her usual station by the side of his easy-chair, and began to shout in his ear. "Here's my niece Mary, Sir Sampson. You remember her when she was little, I dare say. You know you used to call her the Fairy of Lochmarlie, and I'm sure we all thought for long she would have been a perfect fairy. She was so little, but she's tall enough now, you see, and she's going to be married to a fine young man. None of us know him yet, but I think I must have seen him, and at any rate I'm to see him to-morrow, and you'll see him too, Sir Sampson, for Mary is to bring him to call here, and he'll tell you all about the Battle of Waterloo and the Highlanders, for he's half a Highlander too, and I'm certain he'll buy the Duanbog estate, and then when my niece Mary marries Colonel Lennox—" "Lennox?" repeated Sir Sampson, his little dim eyes kindling at the name. "Who talks of Lennox? I won't suffer it. Where's my lady? Lennox? He's a scoundrel. You shan't marry a Lennox," turning to Grizzy. "Call Philistine and my lady," and his agitation was so great that even Grizzy, although accustomed for 40 years to witness similar ebullitions, became alarmed. "You see it's all for fear of my marrying," whispered she to Mary. "I'm sure such a disinterested attachment, it's impossible for me to ever repay it." Then turning to Sir Sampson, she sought to soothe his perturbation by oft-repeated assurances that it was not her but her niece Mary that was going to be married to Colonel Lennox. But in vain Sir Sampson quivered and panted and muttered, and the louder Grizzy screamed out the truth, the more his irritation increased. Recourse was now had to Philistine, and Mary, thoroughly ashamed of the éclat attending the disclosure of her secret, and finding she could be of no use, stole away in the midst of Miss Grizzy's endless verbiage. But as she descended the stairs, she still heard the same assurance resounding. "I can assure you, Sir Sampson, it's not me, but my niece Mary that's going to be married to Colonel Lennox," etc. On returning to Beech Park, she said nothing of what had passed either to Lady Emily or Colonel Lennox, aware of the amusement it would furnish to both, and she felt that her aunt required all the dignity with which she could invest her before presenting her to her future nephew. The only delay to her marriage now rested with herself, but she was desirous it should take place under the roof which had sheltered her infancy and sanctioned by the presence of those whom she had ever regarded as her parents. Lady Emily, Colonel Lennox, and her brother had all endeavoured to combat this resolution, but in vain, and it was therefore settled that she should remain to witness the union of her brother and her cousin, and then return to Lochmarlie. But all Mary's preconceived plans were threatened with a downfall by the receipt of the following letter from Miss Jackie. Glenfern Castle, Shire, June 19, 18 . It is impossible for language to express to you the shame, grief, amazement, and indignation with which we are all filled at the distressing, the ignominious disclosure that has just taken place concerning you through our most excellent friend Miss P. McPry. Oh, Mary, how have you deceived us all! What a dagger have you plunged into all our hearts! Your poor Aunt Grizzy, how my heart bleeds for her! What a difficult part has she to act, and at her time of life, with her acute feelings, with her devoted attachment to the house of Maclaughlan. What a blow, and a blow from your hand! Oh, Mary, I must again repeat, how have you deceived us all! Yet do not imagine I mean to reproach you. Much of the blame is doubtless imputable to the errors of your education. At the same time, even these offer no justification of your conduct upon the present occasion. You are now, I lament to say it, come to that time of life when you ought to know what is right, or where you entertain any doubts, you ought most unquestionably to apply to those who, you may be certain, are well qualified to direct you. But instead of that, you have pursued a diametrically opposite plan, a plan which might have ended in your destruction. Oh, Mary, I cannot too often repeat, how have you deceived us all! From no lips but those of Miss McPry would I have believed what I have heard. Videlicet that you, oh Mary, have for many months past been carrying on a clandestine correspondence with a young man, unknown, unsuspected by all your friends here, and that young man, the very last man on the face of the earth whom you, or any of us, ought to have given our countenance to. The very man, in short, whom we were all bound by every principle of duty, gratitude, and esteem, to have shunned, and who you are bound from this moment to renounce for ever. How you ever came to be acquainted with Colonel Charles Lennox of Rose Hall is a mystery none of us can fathom. But surely the person, whoever it was that brought it about, has much to answer for. Mrs. Douglas, to whom I thought it proper to make an immediate communication on the subject, pretends to have been well informed of all that has been going on, and even insists that your acquaintance with the Lennox family took place through Lady Maclaughlan. But that we all know to be morally impossible. Lady Maclaughlan is the very last person in the world who would have introduced you, or any young creature for whom she had the slightest regard, to a Lennox, the mortal enemy of the Maclaughlan race. I most sincerely trust she is spared the shock we have all experienced at this painful disclosure. With her high principles and great regard for us, I tremble to think what might be the consequences. And dear Sir Sampson, in his delicate state, how would he ever be able to stand such a blow, and a blow too from your hand? Mary, you, who he was always like a father to, many a time, I am sure, have you sat upon his knee, and you certainly cannot have forgot the elegant Shetland pony he presented you with the day you was 5 years old, and what a return for such favours. But I fondly trust it is not yet too late. You have only to give up this unworthy attachment, and all will be forgotten and forgiven, and we will all receive you as if nothing had happened. Oh, Mary, I must for the last time repeat, how have you deceived us all! I am your distressed aunt, Joan Douglas. P.S. I conclude abruptly in order to leave room for your Aunt Nicky to state her sentiments also on this most afflicting subject. Nicky's appendix was as follows. Dear Mary, Jackie has read her letter to us. It is most excellent. We are all much affected by it. Not a word but deserves to be printed. I can add nothing. You see, if you marry Colonel L., none of us can be at your marriage. How could we? I hope you will think twice about it. Second thoughts are best. What's done cannot be undone. Yours, N.D. Mary felt somewhat in the situation of the sleeper awakened as she perused these mysterious anathemas, and rubbed her eyes more than once in hopes of dispelling the mist that she thought must needs be upon them, but in vain. It seemed only to increase with every effort she made to remove it. Not a single ray of light fell on the palpable obscure of Miss Jackie's composition that could enable her to penetrate the dark profound that encompassed her. She was aware, indeed, that when her aunt meant to be pathetic or energetic, she always had recourse to the longest and the strongest words she could possibly lay her hands upon, and Mary had been well accustomed to hear her childish faults and juvenile indiscretions denounced in the most awful terms as crimes of the deepest dye. Many an exordium she had listened to on the tearing of her frock, or the losing of her glove, that might have served as a preface to the Newgate Calendar, Colquhoun on the police, or any other register of crimes. Still she had always been able to detect some clue to her own misdeeds, but here even conjecture was baffled, and in vain she sought for some resting place for her imagination in the probable misdemeanour of her lover. But even allowing all possible latitude for Jackie's pen, she was forced to acknowledge there must be some ground for her aunt to build upon. Superficial as her structures generally were, like children's card houses, they had always something to rest upon, though unlike them her creations were invariably upon a gigantic scale. Mary had often reflected with surprise that although Lady Maclaughlan had been the person to introduce her to Mrs. Lennox, no intercourse had taken place between the families themselves, and when she had mentioned them to each other, Mrs. Lennox had only sighed, and Lady Maclaughlan had humphed. She despaired of arriving at the knowledge of the truth from her aunts. Grizzy's brain was a mere wisp of contradictions, and Jackie's mind was of that violent hue that cast its own shade upon every object that came into contact with it. To mention the matter to Colonel Lennox was only to make the relations ridiculous, and in short, although it was a formidable step, the result of her deliberation was to go to Lady Maclaughlan and request a solution of her aunt's dark sayings. She therefore departed for Milsom Street, and upon entering the drawing-room found Grizzy alone, and evidently in even more than usual perturbation. "Oh, Mary," cried she, as her niece entered, "I'm sure I'm thankful you're come. I was just wishing for you. You can't think how much mischief your yesterday's visit has done. It's 1,000 pities, I declare, that ever you said a word about your marriage to Sir Sampson. But of course I don't mean to blame you, Mary. You know you couldn't help it, so don't vex yourself, for you know that will not make the thing any better now. Only if Sir Sampson should die, to be sure I must always think it was that killed him, and I'm sure it will soon kill me too, such a friend. Oh, Mary!" Here a burst of grief choked poor Miss Grizzy's utterance. "My dear aunt," said Mary, "you certainly must be mistaken. Sir Sampson seems to retain no recollection of me. It is therefore impossible that I could cause him any pain or agitation." "Oh, certainly," said Grizzy. "There's no doubt Sir Sampson has quite forgot you, Mary, and no wonder with your being so long away. But I dare say he'll come to know you yet. But I'm sure I hope to goodness he'll never know you as Mrs. Lennox, Mary. That would break his heart altogether, for you know the Lennoxes have always been the greatest enemies of the Maclaughlans, and of course Sir Sampson can't bear anybody of the name, which is quite natural, and it was very thoughtless in me to have forgot that till Philistine put me in mind of it, and poor Sir Sampson has had a very bad night. So I'm sure I hope, Mary, you'll never think any more about Colonel Lennox, and take my word for it, you'll get plenty of husbands yet. Now, since there's a peace, there will be plenty of fine young officers coming home. There's young Balcadan, a captain I know in some regiment, and there's Dalahoolish and Lochgrunason, and—" But Miss Grizzy's ideas here shot out into so many ramifications upon so many different branches of the county tree that it would be in vain for any but a true Celt to attempt to follow her. Mary again tried to lead her back to the subject of the Lennoxes, in hopes of being able to extract some spark of knowledge from the dark chaos of her brain. "Oh, I'm sure, Mary, if you want to hear about that, I can tell you plenty about the Lennoxes, or at any rate about the Maclaughlans, which is the same thing. But I must first find my housewife." To save Miss Grizzy's reminiscence, a few words will suffice to clear up the mystery. A family feud of remote origin had long subsisted between the families of Lennox and Maclaughlan, which had been carefully transmitted from father to son, till the hereditary brand had been deposited in the breast of Sir Sampson. By the death of many intervening heirs, General Lennox, then a youth, was next in succession to the Maclaughlan estate, but the power of alienating it was vested in Sir Sampson, as the last remaining heir of the entail. By the mistaken zeal of their friends, both were at an early period placed in the same regiment, in the hope that constant an association together would quickly destroy their mutual prejudices and produce a reconciliation. But the inequalities were too great to ever assimilate. Sir Sampson possessed a large fortune, a deformed person, and a weak, vain, irritable mind. General, then Ensign Lennox, had no other patrimony than his sword, a handsome person, high spirit, and dauntless courage. With these tempers, it may easily be conceived that 1,000 trifling events occurred to keep alive the hereditary animosity. Sir Sampson's mind expected from his poor kinsman a degree of deference and respect, which the other, so far from rendering, rather sought opportunities of showing his contempt for, and of thwarting and ridiculing him upon every occasion, till Sir Sampson was obliged to quit the regiment. From that time it was understood that all bearing the name of Lennox were for ever excluded from the succession to the Maclaughlan estates, and it was deemed a sort of petty treason even to name the name of a Lennox in presence of this dignified chieftain. Many years had worn away, and Sir Sampson had passed through the various modifications of human nature, from the mewling infant to mere oblivion, without having become either wiser or better. His mind remained the same, irascible and vindictive to the last. Lady Maclaughlan had too much sense to attempt to reason or argue him out of his prejudices, but she contrived to prevent him from ever executing a new entail. She had known and esteemed both General and Mrs. Lennox before her marriage with Sir Sampson, and she was too firm and decided in her predilections ever to abandon them. And while she had the credit of sharing in all her husband's animosity, she was silently protecting the lawful rights of those who had long ceased to consider them as such. General Lennox had always understood that he and his family were under Sir Sampson's ban, and he possessed too high a spirit ever to express a regret, or even allude to the circumstances. It had therefore made a very faint impression on the minds of any of his family, and in the long lapse of years had been almost forgot by Mrs. Lennox, till recalled by Lady Maclaughlan's letter. But she had been silent on the subject to Mary, for she could not conceal from herself that her husband had been to blame, that the heat and violence of his temper had often led him to provoke and exasperate where mildness and forbearance would have soothed and conciliated, without detracting from his dignity. But her gentle heart shrank from the task of unnecessarily disclosing the faults of the man she had loved. And then she heard Mary talk with rapture of the wild beauties of Lochmarlie. She had only sighed to think that the pride and prejudice of others had alienated the inheritance of her son. But all this Mary was still in ignorance of, for Miss Grizzy had gone completely astray in the attempt to trace the rise and progress of the Lennox and Maclaughlan feud. Happily, Lady Maclaughlan's entrance extricated her from her labyrinth, as it was the signal for her to repair to Sir Sampson. Mary, in some little confusion, was beginning to express to her ladyship regret at hearing that Sir Sampson had been so unwell, when she was stopped. "My dear child, don't learn to tell lies. You don't care twopence for Sir Sampson. I know all. You are going to be married to Charles Lennox. I'm glad of it. I wished you to marry him. Whether you'll thank me for that 20 years hence, I can't tell. You can't tell. He can't tell. God knows. Humph. Your aunts will tell you he is Beelzebub, because his father said he could make a Sir Sampson out of a mouldy lemon. Perhaps he could. I don't know, but your aunts are fools. You know what fools are, and so do I. There are plenty of fools in the world, but if they had not been sent for some wise purpose, they wouldn't have been here, and since they are here, they have as good a right to have elbow room in the world as the wisest. Sir Sampson hated General Lennox because he laughed at him, and if Sir Sampson had lived 100 years ago, his hatred might have been a fine thing to talk about now. It is the same passion that makes heroes of your de Montforts and your Manuels and your Corsairs, and all the rest of them. But they wore cloak and daggers, and these are the supporters of hatred. Everybody laughs at the hatred of a little old man in a cocked hat. You may laugh too. So now, God bless you. Continue as you are, and marry the man you like, though the world should set its teeth against you. 'Tis not every woman can be trusted to do that. Farewell." And with a cordial salute they parted. Mary was too well accustomed to Lady Maclaughlin's style not to comprehend that her marriage with Colonel Lennox was an event she had long wished for, and now most warmly sanctioned, and she hastened home to convey the glad tidings in a letter to her aunts, though doubtful if the truth itself would be able to pierce its way through their prejudices. Another stroke of palsy soon rendered Sir Sampson unconscious even to the charms of Grizzy's conversation, and she was no longer of use to him, and was evidently at a loss how to employ herself. Mary proposed that she could accompany her back to Lochmarlie, to which she yielded a joyful assent. Once convinced of Lady Maclaughlin's approbation of her niece's marriage, she could think and talk of nothing else. Some wise individuals have thought that most people act from the inspiration of either a good or an evil power. To which class Miss Grizzy belonged would have puzzled the most profound metaphysician to determine. She was, in fact, a Maclaughlinite, but to find the root of Maclaughlan is another difficulty. Thought is lost. Colonel Lennox, although a little startled at his first introduction to his future aunt, soon came to understand the naivety of her character, and his enlarged mind and good temper made such ample allowance for her weaknesses that she protested with tears in her eyes she never knew the like of him, she never could think enough of him. She wished to goodness Sir Sampson was himself again, and could only see him. She was sure he would think just as she did, etc., etc., etc. The day of Lady Emily's marriage arrived, and found her in a more serious mood than she had hitherto appeared in, though it seemed doubtful whether it was most occasioned by her own prospects, or the thoughts of parting with Mary, who with Aunt Grizzy was to set off for Lochmarlie immediately after witnessing the ceremony. Edward and his bride would fain have accompanied her, but Lord Courtland was too much accustomed to his daughter and amused by his nephew to bear their absence, and they therefore yielded the point, though with reluctance. "This is all for want of a little opposition to have braced my nerves," said Lady Emily, as she dropped a few tears. "I verily believe I should have wept outright had I not happily descried Dr. Redgill shrugging his shoulders at me. That has given a fillip to my spirits. After all, 'tis perhaps a foolish action I've committed. The icy bonds of matrimony are upon me already. I feel myself turning into a fond, faithful, rational, humble, meek-spirited wife. Alas! I must now turn my head into a museum, and hang up all my smart sayings inside my brain, there to petrify, as warnings to all pert misses. Dear Mary, if ever I am good for anything, it will be to you I owe it." Mary could only embrace her cousin in silence as she parted from her brother, and her with the deepest emotion, and, assisted by Colonel Lennox, who was to follow, took her station by the side of her aunt. "I wish you a pleasant journey, Miss Mary," cried Dr. Redgill. "The game season is coming on, and—" But the carriage drove off, and the rest of the sentence was dispersed by the wind, and all that could be collected was, "Grouse always acceptable, friends at a distance, roebuck stuff with heather carries well at all times, etc., etc." To one less practised in her ways, and less gifted with patience, the eternal babbling of Aunt Grizzy as a travelling companion would have occasioned considerable ennui, if not spleen. There are perhaps few greater trials of temper than that of travelling with a person who thinks it necessary to be actively pleasant without a moment's intermission, from the rising till the setting sun. Grizzy was upon this fatal plan, the rock of thousands. Silence she thought synonymous with low spirits, and she talked and wondered and exclaimed incessantly, and assured Mary she need not be uneasy. She was certain Colonel Lennox would follow very soon. She had not the least doubt of that. She would not be surprised if he was to be at Lochmarlie almost as soon as themselves, at any rate very soon after them. But even these little torments were forgot by Mary when she found herself again in her native land. The hills, the air, the waters, the people, even the peat stacks, had a charm that touched her heart and brought tears into her eyes as they pictured home. But her feelings arose to rapture when Lochmarlie burst upon her view in all the grandeur, beauty, and repose of a setting sun, shedding its farewell rays of gold and purple, and tints of such matchless hue as no pencil e'er can imitate, no poet's pen describe. Rocks, woods, hills, and waters, all shone with a radiance that seemed of more than earthly beauty. Oh, there are moments in life, keen, blissful, never to be forgotten, and such was the moment to Mary, when the carriage stopped, and she again heard the melody of that voice familiar from infancy, and looked on the face known with her being, and was pressed to the heart where glowed a parent's love. When Mary recovered from the first almost agonizing transports of joy, she marked with delight the increased animation and cheerfulness visible in Mrs. Douglas. All the livelier feelings of her warm heart had indeed been excited and brought into action by the spirit and playfulness of her little boy, and the increased happiness of her husband, while all her uneasiness respecting her former lover was now at an end. She had heard from himself that he had married and was happy, without being guilty of inconstancy. Such are the effects of time upon mutable human nature. Colonel Lennox lost no time in arriving to claim his promised bride, and Mary's happiness was complete when she found her own choice so warmly approved of by the friends she loved. The three aunts and their unmarried nieces, now the sole inhabitants of Glenfern Castle, were not quite decided in their opinions at first. Miss Jackie looked with a suspicious eye upon the mortal enemy of the Maclachlan race, but upon better acquaintance his gaiety and good humour contrived to charm asleep even her good sense and prejudices, and she pronounced him to be a pleasant, well-informed young man who gave himself no airs, although he certainly had rather a high look. Nicky doubted from his appearance that he would be nice, and she had no patience with nice men, but Nicky's fears vanished when she saw, as she expressed it, how pleasantly he ate the sheep's head, although he had never seen one in his life before. The younger ladies thought Captain McNab had a finer complexion, and wondered whether Colonel Lennox, like him, would be dressed in full regimentals at his marriage. But alas, all earthly good still blends itself with harm. For on the day of Mary's marriage, a day consecrated to mirth, and bride cake, and wedding favours, and marriage presents, and good cheers, and reels, and revelry, and bagpipes, on that very day, when the marriage ceremony was scarcely over, arrived the accounts of the death of Sir Sampson Maclachlan. But on this joyous day even Grizzy's tears did not flow so freely as they would have done at another time, and she declared that although it was impossible anyone could feel more than she did, yet certainly it would not be using Colonel and Mrs. Lennox well to be very distressed upon such an occasion, and there was no doubt but she would have plenty of time to be sorry about it yet, when they were all sitting quietly by themselves, with nothing else in their heads, though, to be sure, they must always think what a blessing it was that Colonel Lennox was to succeed. "I wish he may ever fill Sir Sampson's shoes," said Miss Nicky with a sigh. "Colonel Lennox cannot propose a better model to himself than Sir Sampson Maclachlan," said Miss Jackie. "He has left him a noble example of propriety, frugality, hospitality, and respectability, and above all, of forgiveness of his mortal enemies." "Oh, Mary!" exclaimed Miss Grizzy, as they were about to part with their niece, "what a lucky creature you are! Never, I am sure, did any young person set out in life with such advantages. To think of your succeeding to Lady Maclachlan's laboratory, all so nicely fitted up with every kind of thing, and especially plenty of the most charming bark, which I'm sure will do Colonel Lennox the greatest good. As you know, all officers are much the better of bark. I know it was the saving of young Ballingall's life when he came home in an ague from some place, and I'm certain Lady Maclachlan will leave you everything that is there. You was always such a favourite. Not but what I must always think that you had a hand in dear Sir Sampson's death. Indeed, I have no doubt of it. Yet at the same time I don't mean to blame you in the least, for I'm certain if Sir Sampson had been spared, he would have been delighted, as we all are, at your marriage." Colonel and Mrs. Lennox agreed in making choice of Lochmarlie for their future residence, and in a virtuous attachment they found as much happiness as earth's pilgrims ever possess, whose greatest felicity must spring from a higher source. The extensive influence which generally attends upon virtue joined to prosperity was used by them for its best purposes. It was not confined either to rich or poor, to caste or sect, but all shared in their benevolence, whom that benevolence could benefit, and the poor, the sick, and the desolate united in blessing what heaven had already blessed, this happy marriage. End of Volume 2, Chapter 34. End of Marriage, Volume 2, by Susan Ferrier.